Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your first day at Build. My name is Michaela Hutchinson. I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio for Mac and Xamarin Platform teams, and I'm here to tell you about all of the exciting new features in Visual Studio for Mac. So let's get a quick show of hands. Who among you have used Visual Studio for Mac? OK, that's a lot. I noticed a few people didn't, though, so we'll get a quick recap of what it is. So it is a modern .NET IDE for the Mac that has a native Mac feel. So if you're using a Mac, that's because you want to use a Mac and get the Mac experience. So we give you the Mac experience, but for developing .NET code, C# and F#. It supports mobile through Xamarin. It supports web through ASP.NET Core, cloud through Azure Functions, and games through Unity. So we launched this at Build of last year. So it's been 1 year. It's a year old. It's kind of incredible to think that it's been there for a year now, and we've made 5 updates since we launched it. Just this morning, we launched 7.5 and also the 7.6 preview. And as I go through my presentation, I will call out some of the features from the latest releases. But I'm also going to cover the entire range since Build of last year to show you all of the things that we've been working on and kind of the direction that it's going. So I'm going to start out with web, with the ASP.NET Core workload. So at Build of last year, we shipped .NET Core 2 preview support. That went RTW over the summer. In today's 7.5 release, we have support for the .NET Core 2.1 release candidate. So if you install that, you'll get that as an option in your file new project templates. We have support for various features of that. So when you first create and run a project, we'll install the HTTPS certificate so you can do secure local development and make sure that your site works with HTTPS before you push it. We also did a lot of little quality of life improvements. So for example, we added file watcher support. So if you add a file to your project that would be included by the wildcards in the CS proj, those now automatically show up. Now, one of the big features that we are announcing today is our Razor language service. This is something that we ported over from VS on Windows, and we did a lot of work in our text editor to make it more compatible with the same APIs to help us bring features like this over. So it has support for all of the things that you'd expect in Razor. You get IntelliSense, info tooltips for both the C# and the HTML in the page. We also today shipped TypeScript and JavaScript language services. So you now have the full range of client-side web development languages. So this really rounds out our web development story. So this, again, is using the same TypeScript and JavaScript language service as VS on Windows. One of the other smaller features that we added is that we added the ability to specify a custom .NET Core location. So if you download one of the master builds from GitHub, for example, or builds .NET Core 2 from source, since it's open source, you can configure VS for Mac to use that build rather than just using ones installed into the global location. And in the publishing space, we have support for publishing to Azure App Service. We also have support for Docker. So if you want to containerize your ASP.NET Core project, that's as simple as right-clicking on the project, add Docker support. And when you publish a containerized project to Azure, we'll set it up with the Azure Container Registry and all that. automatically. So I'm going to show this to you quickly. I'm going to keep my demos pretty short and simple because I have a lot to get through. So this is Visual Studio for Mac, and there it is. Okay, yes, so can everyone at the back read that on that scale? Okay, so I'm going to do a new project, and you can see here that I can create an ASP.NET Core app. I'm going to create a web app which uses Razor Pages by default. If you want the older style, you can create an MVC app. I'm going to do next, and you can see here I now have the choice for .NET Core 2.1 because I installed the release candidate on my machine first thing this morning. So I'm going to name my project, and for some reason I always typo project names in presentations. So here we have our project. So you can see it has all the Razor here, and the we have our Razor views, we have our JavaScript and CSS, and so on. And it's fully restored. So if we build, and run, this is running on .NET Core 2.1, and it opens up in Safari, and here we have an ASP.NET Core 2.1 app running on a Mac. And of course you can debug it as well. Okay, so this is quite complicated. My app doesn't need all of this overview of why you should use ASP.NET Core because I'm using it already. So I'm going to go into here, and I'm going to just add some simple text so you can see the HTML and IntelliSense in the Razor view there. And here we have our CSharp IntelliSense with all the tooltips and so on that you would expect. And that doesn't exist, so it's squiggled. And so I'm now going to go into the page here and add a property for that to fetch. And save that, build it. And when we rerun that, it reloads. And here we have our, oh, looks like I missed the hello. Well, now it's more like a command. Build, everyone go build. Anyway, so rebuild that. So now I'm going to quickly show you some TypeScript in action. So I'm going to add a dependency on the TypeScript build logic. So that's simply adding a NuGet package to the project. Agree to the license. And now I'm going to add a TS config file. We don't currently have templates for this, but it's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to just reveal the directory in Finder, drop a tsconfig.json in there, and then that should show up here momentarily. Maybe not. Let's just reopen it. That normally fixes issues. OK, here we go. So here's our tsconfig.json. And as you can see, that's using our JSON editor. It went and found the schema. And so this simply includes the TypeScript files from a TS directory and compiles them to replace the site JavaScript file that's part of this project. So I'm going to just create this folder. And you can see there the add Docker support. Though I'm not going to go into this now. And in here, I'm going to add a TypeScript file. hello.ts. And now we're editing the TypeScript file, and as you can see, we have TypeScript in IntelliSense. And so this is simply going to alert, and then document dot, oh. So you can see our function has showed up in IntelliSense as well. And now when I build this, it's going to compile the TypeScript, and that's going to replace the site.ts. So this is the compiled TypeScript. Looks awfully similar to the source TypeScript, because I wasn't really using any of the TypeScript features there because it's so simple. But now when I run this, it's going to load, and then I think I got that wrong. So I'm more of a CSharp developer than a TypeScript developer. Fortunately, I had an example I prepared earlier. Window.onload, not document.onload. And now it's running, and there we go. So that was some TypeScript written with TypeScript IntelliSense. So next I'm going to talk about some of the new features we have in the mobile space for Xamarin apps. So for Xamarin iOS, we added support for the latest iOS 11.4 and Xcode 9.4 and all of the versions along the way to those. We also have support for debugging and deploying over Wi-Fi now using the Apple APIs for that, which means you can deploy to Apple TVs, for example, over Wi-Fi. If your Apple TV isn't right next to your Mac, that makes it a lot easier. It's also great if you're developing for iPhone or iOS and you have devices attached to the accessory port. For those of you who are doing AI development, we added support for Core ML models. If you add one of those to your project, we can automatically generate C# bindings to that model so you can use it from C#. We also have a whole bunch of little quality of life improvements all throughout the iOS experience. We also added support for automatic iOS provisioning. This is one of my favorite features because it means you no longer really have to care about the ins and outs of provisioning profiles. You simply log into your Apple account and select your team, and Then turn on automatic provisioning in your info plist, and it will automatically create certificates and a provisioning profile for you and download them and set them up. And that also has support for entitlements. So if you go and change your entitlements in your entitlements.plist, it will go and update the provisioning profile to have those entitlements and download the updated version. We've also made some major changes to the iOS designer. Its layout model with constraints now much more closely follows the Xcode model. So as you can see here, you can design a UI that will relay out as you rotate your device or use a different screen size and so on. The developer who developed this asked me to tell you that there's a sort of hidden feature. If you hold down Control, the handles will appear. So you don't have to just go and toggle them on and off in the toolbar. You can just hold down Control and drag and connect them. It's super neat, and I'd never found it if you didn't tell me. So now you all know. So on the Android front, we added support for the latest Android version, Android Oreo, the 8.1 and so on. We also have an integrated SDK manager, so no longer do you have to open an external app to manage your Android SDK pieces. That's now integrated into preferences, and it's more aware, because it's not generic, it's specific to the Xamarin scenario, it's more aware of like what pieces you need for Xamarin development, so it's not going to try and download unnecessary or out-of-date pieces. We also have a whole bunch of quality of life improvements there. For example, we've made a lot of improvements to the AXML IntelliSense. And we also have a new Android device manager. This allows you to create emulators, and it's a much nicer experience than the old one. As you can see here, you have a nice list of devices, and when you do a new device, you could go and set up all the options. We're currently looking into giving you some kind of pre-built devices for common scenarios. But the really neat thing is that you don't have to download images before you create your device. You can just pick which image you want, and if you don't have it installed, then the device manager will download that automatically for you because it works with the SDK manager. For Xamarin Forms, we have switched over the templates to use .NET Standard now. We've done a lot of work on the AXML IntelliSense, on the XAML IntelliSense, just to tune that up. So you can see here, for example, we now have support for data templates. They show up both from XAML definitions and from CSharp definitions. There's also a whole load of updates to the live player. I'm not going to get into this in detail because there's a lot of other talks about all of these topics, but I'll give you some recommendations for other sessions at the end. So on the cloud front, we have Azure Functions, and this is something that we initially previewed at Build last year. And now in 7.5, it is now part of the product by default. When we previewed it, it was very much kind of a proof of concept built on a port of functions to the Mono runtime. Now it is running on the Azure Functions .NET Core 2 based SDK. So your functions will run on the .NET Core 2 runtime. That SDK is still in preview, but the Azure Functions tooling in VS for Mac is now stable and is in the stable release. So I'm just going to create a new Azure function here. And If you've used this before, one difference you might notice is that we now create a function in the project by default, so you don't have to go and look up what should my first function look like. Another thing that we've done is we've added the right-click add function. So this dialog lets you pick from a range of sort of standard boilerplate functions. And so I could say, for example, that I want an HTTP trigger with parameters, and I want it to be called hello. Let's check that doesn't conflict with this one. Yep. So, and that creates a new function called hello. And so I'm going to build that and run that. Oh, that's weird. My Mac is doing weird things. My display is acting up right now. I think I can still. I'll just have to use that display instead of my display. OK, so if I go to Safari, so I have a link to this already. Was it running? It didn't start. There we go. So here we go. So it starts up the functions runtime. You can see functions beginning to boot up there. And now the function is available at, so there's two here. So there's, so going to look at the API hello name. So I have a link to this already. So here we go. So so here I've opened the HTTP trigger function, and it wants a name in the request body. Oh, bless you. So I'm going to just go back and put a breakpoint in that function. That was the HTTP trigger. And I'm going to be incredibly original, and the name is going to be build. Again, here we go. So now it breaks on the breakpoint, and as you can see here, Oh, you are very correct. There we go. And I should probably resume that. And then it's going to hit again. And there we go. So we have our name. And if I resume that, we'll see that the function returned hello build. So it's a very simple function. Just an example of how easy it is to get started creating a function. Now, I kind of got things out of order a little bit because I forgot to tell you what functions were first. So does everyone here know what Azure Functions are? OK, some people didn't know it. So the quick summary is they're a serverless architecture, so you can write a function, upload it into the cloud, and then it scales out depending on how much it's being called. They're super easy to connect to each other and to various Azure services like queues and blob storage and so on. And there's a very straightforward C# programming model that you just saw. But you can also use it with other languages, just not in VS for Mac. Yeah, and I told you this already as well. So all of that stuff is new in the 7.5 preview, which you can download today. So next I'm going to take a quick look at the core features that all these workloads share, and the C# productivity features. So we've heard from a lot of you that performance and reliability are something that is important to you. And so we've been doing a lot of work on this. In terms of performance, we've been focusing on things like startup time, on solution load time, on IntelliSense and editor responsiveness to try and make sure that it pops up quickly, that it doesn't stall. also reducing memory use to reduce GC hangs, and even down to things like concurrent execution of Roslyn analyzers, which makes results come back faster. So this is something we have a lot of improvements in the 7.5 release, more coming up in 7.6. We also have developer community report a problem, which you can get to from help report a problem. And so if you run into any issues that are causing you problems, please tell us about them. Even if someone else has reported the issue, you can go and vote it up to help us prioritize them. Because even when we test things, we don't necessarily have the same environments that you do, or our projects aren't necessarily doing the same things. So that feedback is super important to us. And thank you very much to everyone who has reported issues there. So here's a chart showing some of the performance improvements that we made. So going from 7.4 to 7.5, we cut startup time to half what it was, and in 7.6 preview 1, it's even a little lower. We've also made improvements on solution load, and we have some more improvements on both of these coming up. Now, Visual Studio for Mac is based on the same foundational components as a lot of as Visual Studio is on Windows. So it's built on Roslyn for CSharp, IntelliSense, and refactorings and analyzers and so on. It also shares a lot of the same editor APIs now, so that's enabled us to bring over the TypeScript and JavaScript and Razor and CSS and HTML and so on by working with the VS editor team to bring those APIs over so the extensions could be ported from the Windows version. It's built on MS Build. The debugger that you just saw for .NET Core uses the VS Code debugger protocol. You can use TextMate for syntax highlighting. There's a whole bunch of shared components that enable us to deliver features on Mac more easily. And so this is something that we've been working on a lot. It's not super visible because it's not something you see directly, but this is what's enabled us to bring things like Razor and TypeScript to you. The core is actually open source. It's an open source project on GitHub called Monodevelop, and contributions are welcome, or you can just check it out, read the source code if you're interested. There have been a lot of improvements to C# productivity over the past year based on all of the updates that we have from Roslyn. So as we've pulled in new Roslyn features, we've gained new analyzers, new refactorings, new fixes, support for C# 7.1, C# 7.2. And kind of going back to the foundations, we've done a lot of internal work to enable us to use some of the higher level Roslyn features that we previously weren't using, which is going to enable those higher level features to come over faster as well. And one tiny little thing that's near and dear to my heart is that in 7.6 we've turned code folding on by default. It's kind of small, but we've had that for a long time, but a lot of folks weren't actually aware it was there because it was in preferences. So we've done some, we've overhauled the visual look and feel a little bit, and it's now turned on by default. This is probably my favorite new feature of this release, though. We have EditorConfig support. The summary of EditorConfig is it enables you to define your code style in a file in the root of your project or various subdirectories. And that means that anyone working on your project gets the same code style. So if you're working on a team or open source, it makes sure that you have consistent style, consistent formatting. You can even, Roslyn has extended the EditorConfig format by also allowing you to define things like whether system directives should be sorted first when you sort usings, or your formatting, like whether you want a space between your method name and declaration here. And you can also control some of the analyzers as well. Like this one on the screen here is C# style pattern matching over is with cast check. And that's basically if you're using the older style of doing a is foo type bar, then cast it. You can just do the do the is pattern matching. So is foo or whatever. And you can turn these on in your EditorConfig. So if you have strict rules about like whether you should be using the newer style on your project, you can make sure everyone on the team has those turned on. And you can control whether they're highlighted as suggestions or errors. And there's literally probably 100 of these. So it's very fine-grained. And so next, I'm going to show you a few of these things. So this is the preview release here, and you can see here our beautiful new code folding. It looks like VS Code. It only appears when you're near it, unless things are folded. So here is a C# file in one of my own projects, which is an MS-Build IntelliSense extension that you can download from the extension gallery. So as you can see here, the analyzers aren't really showing much. They're suggesting that, so I have a to-do here, and it's also suggesting that I can convert this to a static method call. So I'm just going to Alt-Enter, to an extension method call. So Alt-Enter to fix that. So that's simplified that a little bit. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other refactorings here as well, like Alt-Enter is the way to get to those. So I can say move this to its own file, or I can copy the comments from the base class. There's literally a couple of hundred analyzers and fixes here. It doesn't necessarily always tell you when they're available because we don't have the light bulb experience. So just try it. Use Alt-Enter and see what shows up. If you're interested in seeing like the full list of what is available, you can go into Preferences, and here in the source analysis, we have a list of, so here's all of the refactorings, and here's all of the analyzers. So there's a whole bunch of them, and you can turn them on and off if there are some that you don't like. And a lot of them are off by default because they're ones that might be somewhat contentious. So this project actually has an EditorConfig. So this is fairly long, but what I'm going to do is that I'm going to say that I only want to use var when the type is apparent. So currently I have it set up to prefer var for all types. But I'm going to turn it on only for when it's apparent. And so now, when I go back to that file, it'll take just a second for the analyzer results to show up. Should. Okay. So because these are only suggestions, they're not actually showing up in the. Okay, that's odd. That might be a bug. But you can see the tooltip here. If the squiggle was showing up, it's clearly there. So it's saying that this one is wrong because it's not a parent. Like what is a type of parent? So if I Alt-Enter this, I can actually fix it. So use explicit type instead of var. Try to zoom out a bit so you can see the preview. You can see what change it's going to make. Turns out that the parent is an expression node. And I can actually also fix all and change all of them. It takes a second. There we go. So now it's turned a whole load of my vars into explicit types. So now the style of my file matches the style that we specified in the EditorConfig. And so these are respected by VS for Mac, by VS Code. So anyone using any of those editors will get the same settings. You can also control the formatting, so the method name between the so the space between the method declaration name and the open parenthesis, which is quite a mouthful. I'm glad I didn't have to type that out. So currently you have to close and reload the file for the updated settings to take effect. But now, if I format the code, which is Command I, you can see that it changed all of these to no longer have those spaces. So if I Command Z, Command Shift Z, you can see the change that the formatter made. So this is one of my favorite features because I work on a lot of open source, and it's really frustrating when I see pull requests from folks who weren't aware of what the code style was, and then you have to go and ask them nicely to fix it. Yep. So one more thing before I finish. Today we announced Team Foundation version control support. This is currently in preview. You can download it today from the extension gallery. It has all of the core version control operations that you'd expect from Team Foundation version control. You can map things into workspaces and all that good stuff. So this was one of the top requested features on our user voice, the second top. And so that's why we built it, because you asked us for it. So please tell us about the features that we don't have that you want, because it does make a difference. So please download it and try it out if TFVC is something that you use. And we would love to know what you think of it, so we can make sure that it's a really great experience. So I'm going to finish up with a bunch of resource links. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, you can download it from ak.ms/vsmac. There's also the docs are really great. Our docs team has done a fantastic job of all of the conceptual docs about using the various features and so on. You can also report a problem or make a suggestion, and you can also get to those from the help menu. If you tweet, we have a hashtag #VS4Mac. Or you can tweet at Visual Studio, or you can tweet at me, at MJ Hutchinson. I do answer questions, so if you're just wondering if there's a better way to do something, or whether a feature is there or not, or have some feedback about a crash or something, Twitter isn't necessarily the best medium for reporting crashes, but I will do my best to answer anything that folks tweet at me. And I touched on a lot of things very briefly, but there's a lot more great sessions covering them in more depth. So it's a quick list here if folks want to take a photograph of that. These are also all recorded. I know a couple of them happened already, but if you didn't see those, you can go and watch them online, or if you're watching this online, you can go watch them online. One of those, though, there is a tips and tricks talk in a theater session on Wednesday at 2, which I very much recommend because there's a lot of awesome features that you kind of have to know they're there to use them, or like easier ways to do things and so on. So I recommend checking that theater session out. And finally, complete your evaluations, and we have prizes every day. So I have about 5 minutes left, so does anyone have any questions? Yeah, could you please go to the microphone so folks who watch this online? Okay.
Sure. So one problem that we've had with Visual Studio for Mac is support for corporate proxies defined in a pack file. Has any work been done towards that?
Yes. So support for corporate proxies that use a pack file. Yeah, so the network stack that we use doesn't have great support for proxies. There's also like corporate proxies tend to have like a whole bunch of different gotchas, and it's really hard to replicate them. But we've been switching various pieces of the code base over to use NSL connection. So that will have the exact same proxy support as macOS itself, rather than the proxy support in the mono runtimes stack. So it's kind of an incremental process. So if there are specific features that are really problematic, please let us know about those so we can switch those over. Anyone else have questions? Yeah. Feel free to go up to the mics preemptively.
So you showed different templates of the Azure Functions. Can you put a customized templates there which are for my company, my organization?
Okay, different templates for Azure Functions, and whether you can do custom templates. So yes, you can create your own templates. Currently, we only support extensions adding project templates, not, well, you can add item templates. It's a little more complicated. But yeah, so you can create extensions. If you go to the extension gallery, there's an extension that you can use to write extensions. And so you can package templates inside an extension. And those templates use the exact same templating engine as .NET New uses, so you can share them with that and with VS on Windows as well. If you email me or message me on Twitter, I'm happy to provide more links to specific resources for template creation.
Question? What was that? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Is there plans to bring the Visual Studio live sharing to VS for Mac and vice versa, like between Mac to Mac and Windows to Mac and such?
So the question was about Visual Studio Live Share. So that is something that we would very much like to do. We don't have a specific time frame that we're planning on doing that. There is, I have been told, a GitHub repository for live share issues where you can upvote various things, and VS for Mac is listed in there. So if you go vote it up there, that will help like increase the priority, so it's likely to happen sooner.
This question might be pretty dated, but a year or so back I did a large project with Xamarin Studio. Should we be switching over to Visual Studio for Mac now? I've just been buried in Xamarin Studio and I haven't looked at it yet.
So the question is whether to switch from Xamarin Studio to Visual Studio for Mac, and the answer is yes. VS for Mac completely replaces Xamarin Studio. It has all the same features and a lot more, and it's completely compatible. So I recommend making the upgrade as soon as possible. Okay, great. Thank you all for coming.